Thank you. Well, it's been almost 2 months since Congress was back on the floor, and certainly a lot of things have taken place back home, things in the news that are a little bit shocking and ought to be commented on. The first thing I'd like to point out, and we saw this again in the first week back, a prominent member of this Congress spoke about the need to protect democracy. Again and again, people from both sides of the aisle, but disproportionately from the Democrat side of the aisle, talk about the necessity of protecting democracy and refer to our country as a democracy. The first time I remember hearing this was I was at Marquette University, one of the largest universities in the state of Wisconsin, and a professor of government or history or something like that referred to our country as a democracy. They might want to ponder that when they talk about when we recite the Pledge of Allegiance every day, we talk about a republic, the republic for which it stands. We don't talk about the democracy for which it stands. And people might want to wonder why politicians like to refer to our form of government as democracy, but in the Pledge of Allegiance, we refer to it as a republic. At the time our Constitution was drafted, Ben Franklin talked about giving us a republic if we can keep it. In other words, he didn't say a democracy if we can keep it. He said a republic if we can keep it. You might wonder whether our forefathers ever mentioned democracy, and of course they did. In Federalist Number 10, James Madison wrote that pure democracies where spectacles of turbulence and contention have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been short in their lives, as they have been violent in their deaths. So in other words, James Madison did talk about democracy, and he talked about it negatively. Why do politicians like to not talk about our country being a republic and prefer to talk about it as a democracy or representative democracy? It's because in democracy, the government is determined by the people collectively, or the majority of the people. In a republic, we turn to our Constitution. There may at any given time be a majority of people in this body or a majority of people in this country who don't like a given religion or want to feel we can confiscate people's property, or because there's been a shooting on the news the night before, they want to ignore the Second Amendment, and therefore they like to believe, or they may not like certain religions, and they might want to suppress that religion. They might not like certain ideas, and they want to say, I was elected here, so I can suppress those ideas. There are two examples I'd like to leave this body of, or like to share with this body. There was a bill called the McCain-Feingold bill that was passed by two popular congressmen around the year 2000. And they wanted to restrict what people could say or how much time people could buy in an election. In other words, they wanted to restrict the freedom of speech. And I'm sure both politicians at that time felt we are very popular. We've been elected several times. We have the right to trample on somebody's free speech. And I certainly in election season would like there to be less, or would prefer there be less advertisements, less mailing going on. But the Supreme Court at the time had to lecture, and their McCain-Feingold bill passed. They had to lecture, in essence, Senator Feingold and Senator McCain, that we do not live in a democracy. We don't care whether you got 60 or 65% of the vote in your district. You do not have the right to say certain people cannot buy time on television or send out mailings. Another example, there was a time, I think very highly of the man, a very popular governor in the state of Wisconsin who wanted to say, if you have property along a state highway, we can restrict what you can do on that property, because someday we might want to buy that property when This highway goes from a 2 to a 4-lane highway, and therefore we're going to make your front 50 feet or 60 feet along the highway less valuable. Because after all, we represent the government. We've been elected overwhelmingly. The implication being this is a democracy, and we can take your property from you. And again, the state Supreme Court had to say, hey, wait a minute, we don't have a democracy here. We have a republic. We don't care how popular you are. You cannot interfere with what people can do with their land along a highway. Another example in which politicians wished we had a democracy or a representative democracy so they could tell you what you can do with your property. But in fact, our Constitution stood tall and said, hey, wait a minute, we don't care how you were elected, how many people voted for you, we will not allow you to take people's property. And I believe that's why politicians like to talk about democracy. They like to believe because they got 70% or 51% around here, they can determine what you can and cannot say. So let us all try, as we continue throughout this biennium, to no longer refer to our form of government as a democracy. Let's refer to it what James Madison or Ben Franklin would have liked to have us refer to it as. What they gave us was a republic under our wonderful great Constitution, and even though our Constitution prevents people or allows people to say some things we might disagree with, even though our Constitution allows us to quote our wonderful Holy Bible, even though our Constitution prevents people, the government, from taking people's property without Constitution, even though our Constitution allows the carrying or owning of firearms when a lot of people around here don't think we should have the right to carry those firearms, let us stand with our republic and bravely, just like when we say the Pledge of Allegiance, bravely describe our country as a republic, not a democracy, which, again, James Madison, democracies are spectacles of turbulence and contention, have been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have generally been short in their lives. Now, I think during the month and a half or whatever it was, we were not in Washington, a couple of prominent Americans took aim at our Constitution, and I'm saying particular, they didn't like the First Amendment. They didn't like that people were out there saying things that they disagreed with. And these former politicians both almost became the President of the United States, which shows how precarious our hold on our great republic is. I'm talking in part of Hillary Clinton, former First Lady, but even worse, former Secretary of State who almost became President of the United States. She talked about social media companies and saying they must moderate content on their platforms or we lose total control. In other words, Hillary Clinton felt that the government should control our lives, and they didn't like social media companies allowing things to seep out into the Zeitgeist, and maybe those things were hostile to what Hillary felt. Kind of hard to believe she almost became president, but she should always be remembered as someone who felt the First Amendment caused the government to lose control. Another person, while we were out on recess, John Kerry, another man who almost became President of the United States, called the First Amendment a major block in combating misinformation and fighting climate control. Now, of course, there's a disagreement with regard to climate change, where it comes from, if it's happening. But John Kerry felt the way to deal with this issue was apparently to deal with the First Amendment. And what he was doing here is he was talking to the World Economic Forum in a panel on green energy. So John Kerry was not only trying to trample on the First Amendment rights of Americans. He wanted this idea to spread without the world. Can you imagine if he had ever become President of the United States, a man who called the First Amendment a major block? My goodness. But this is what's going on, and the American public has to wake up. During this time, there was also a letter made public by Mark Zuckerberg, one of the wealthiest men in America. You would think the wealthiest people in America, above all, would have the freedom to exercise their First Amendment rights, but apparently no. It came out the Biden administration weighed in with Mark Zuckerberg, and they didn't like it that people out there had different opinions about COVID and how to address it and what was appropriate. And the Biden administration apparently contacted Mark Zuckerberg and his group, saying that maybe there were things that the American public shouldn't know. In other words, rather than having a free exchange ideas on the value of the vaccine or the value of social distancing or whatever, we shouldn't have open exchange of ideas. It would be better if we didn't have that pesky First Amendment. It would be better if the people who know best, Anthony Fauci or Pfizer, say, that we should just defer to them, because we all know how important Pfizer is, and they certainly give a lot of campaign contributions, which we politicians like, and therefore we should weigh in on the social media platforms and say there's some things that are inconvenient to the country. So I hope when we return, we do something to put a little more energy in that First Amendment, and above all, educate the American public that there are politicians out there like Hillary Clinton or John Kerry or apparently Joe Biden who view the First Amendment as an obstacle in their expansion of government. And I think this is to a certain extent be commented on, but not commented on enough, because too many important people, and here we're talking about one president and two almost presidents, wanted to end people's First Amendment rights. Now, the First Amendment is only one of the things that make America so great. Another one is our I think, things referred to by Nikita Khrushchev and other communists who at the time wanted governments the exact opposite of what we have. We have a free country based on a republic in our Constitution, the Soviet, and based on, or anticipated to be a country for a moral and religious people. Under communism, we had a country aiming for atheism and a totalitarianism in which a government elite decides who we can work for and what goods are to be produced, and the degree to which we penalize people who say things that are not appropriately in line with what the government wants. In any event, Nikita Khrushchev in the 50s and early 60s, at the time the Soviet Union was kind of the center of communism, promised to someday take over the United States. And they'd take over the United States without firing a shot. Now, we spend a great deal around here on munitions, on submarines, on tanks, on airplanes, but it was interesting that at one time, the communists, and I think Nikita Khrushchev was speaking for the communists, felt we would take over this country without firing a shot. What evidence is there that they are trying to weaken our country? I think in addition to the fact that we want to chip away at the First Amendment, I think there is hostility to families, old-fashioned nuclear families going on in this country. And how are we trying to chip away at the families? Because after all, people like Karl Marx did not like the family. One way to look at it is there are currently over 90 programs in the United States in which the benefits of those programs depend on something referred to as percent of poverty. And a percent of poverty calculation penalizes two-parent families, or at least it penalizes two-parent families if at least one of them is working a full-time job. In other words, it encourages one-parent families. There was a time in this country not too long ago, I and probably most of the people in this institution were around in 1965, in which only 5% of the children born in this country were born to families that did not have both a mother and father at home. After building up over time over 90 programs in which it was difficult for this family to form, or easier, you get more money right away to have a family in which only one parent was there, we've worked our way up to a situation in which over 40% of the families, the child is born without both parents at home. And normally this means it's a fatherless family. So in other words, the government, which is supposed to treat everybody equally, if you have a scale out there, is overwhelmingly trying to create an America in which the old-fashioned family is becoming more obsolete. I should point out that this has gone, like I said, from 5% to 40%. Programs that you are eligible for are things like SNAP, or the food stamp program, the low-income housing program, the earned income tax program, the Medicaid health care program, things like the Pell Grant program, the TANF program, cash assistance, SSI disability program for the children, all are inducements not to form an old-fashioned family. And every biennium, last time Joe Biden's final budget request, usually puts new programs on the heap or adds money to old programs to make the gap between somebody who decides to have both parents in a house compared to somebody who only has one family in the house. One person who wrote very eloquently on this, hasn't been listened to as much as he should. Robert Rector is one, but one is George Gilder, who wrote a bestseller in 1980. And I know there was anticipation that Ronald Reagan would act on this book. He was not able to act on it. My guess is primarily because the Republican House was always in the minority at that time. But George Gilder used to look at what normally are referred to as slums or low-income areas of a city. He focused on Albany, New York, and he followed around a young couple where the young lady was pregnant, and to his surprise, it was not cause of concern like it has been throughout all of history when a young gal gets pregnant and is not married. It was a cause for celebration, as the gleeful new couple went around from the low-income housing people to the food stamp people to the Medicaid people and signed up for all sorts of benefits. At the time, they had something called AFDC cash payments, and it was a cause for celebration because now the young lady would not have to live with her parents anymore. She was getting her own place, and I'm sure the people who devised these programs were primarily a money-oriented group, and they felt that this new program would be more likely to have the young lady live on her own without having to live with her mother or with her parents. So they felt they were doing something good. I think over time, given the hostility of Karl Marx, given the hostility to the radicals even in the 60s and 70s, there were people who knew exactly what they were doing as they destroyed the nuclear family in parts of America. In any event, this is something we've got to look at. When you combine federal programs with state programs, which frequently team up with federal programs, you can have situations in which there are $20,000, $30,000, $35,000 penalties for people who decide to get married rather than have people live with a single mother. And it's not like single mothers cannot be very good parents. It is not hard to find people who've been raised in single parent families who are wonderful children. On the other hand, it is tougher. Statistics would show that it's tougher. And in America, where we try to keep everybody equal, we should not continue to have programs which kind of push more and more people into that single family situation. George Gilder also made, George Gilder, I saw him weighing in on a topic just the other day, but like I said, he wrote a great bestseller called Wealth and Poverty in 1980. And he is still around, and he made the case that not only is this bad for the children, but it's bad for the men, because you create swaths of society in which men have no purpose, because traditionally the purpose in an old-fashioned nuclear family is to be the breadwinner. Here we have a situation in which he's not going to be able to make enough money, in many cases, to match the government. And as the result, we have a situation in which the mother marries the government rather than the husband, and in the long run, it hurts the husband as well. I hope that this Congress, with such high hopes, works to take away this marriage penalty. Regardless of what Karl Marx would have said, regardless of what certain radical groups would say, we do not want to penalize the father for becoming part of that household. And we know these people are still around. I mentioned again Black Lives Matter, a group which many people in this institution were not afraid to stand with, coming out against the traditional nuclear family, didn't cause people to run away from that group. There are other quotes of radicals, Angela Davis, that crowd, over the last 50 years, which again, hostile to the nuclear family, making fun of the nuclear family, preference of single parenthood. I hope this Congress begins to chip away at that ideal. And we do not want to any longer have people penalized for going down, for getting married and try to form a traditional family. Indeed, we ought to be encouraging that. The next didn't work out as well as people wanted, but the next attack on freedoms that I think our forefathers would not have seen is congressional programs or programs created by Congress or the executive branch trying to treat people differently by sex or race. These are sometimes referred to as affirmative action program, but there are many other ways to refer to the programs. The idea being that the government ought to aim programs at certain subgroups of society, that we have to weigh in to have a disproportionate number of women in a program compared to the women who want to be the program, a disproportionate number by ancestry, be it Asian American, be it African American, be it so-called Hispanic American, be it Pacific Islander, be it North African. The government should be favoring people by the group that they are from. This is another thing our forefathers would have been opposed to. They wanted to treat all Americans equally. They did not want the government to have our elections become a contest between ethnic groups. They did not want our government programs to be a contest between men and women, as the government weighs in, as they do today, on who owns companies who get government contracts. If you get a government contract, the government wants to know which ethnic group you are, and of course you self-identify, so you could be, because you're 1/4 Hispanic or 1/4 Native American, you should get preferences to a program. Of course, they don't care here on amount of wealth, so you can have a situation in which, say, an Asian American worth tens of millions of dollars gets preference on a government contract compared to a poor person of European descent, poor guy. And the problem is not just the preferences, which are unfair in its own right. It does result, soon we're going to have a bill around here, a lot more government largesse to take care of the problems caused by the hurricanes. It not just results in additional cost, maybe quality, but certainly cost, depending upon who gets the project, but it creates animosity. okay? It creates America in which people say, not, I want to have the best person for this program. Every government program, every government hiring decision becomes a contest between men and women, or a contest between Hispanic or Asian, or what have you. It's kind of a ridiculous contest because America is so non-racist in the first place, but that is what we have going on in the program. We ought to save some money by getting rid of these bureaucrats, and we ought to realize that the purpose of these programs is to divide America. There's a book out, I don't know that it's okay here to use a picture of a book here, but it's called America's Cultural Revolution by Christopher Rufo. And in this book, he points out that this idea of breaking apart America by racial groups would be a way to destroy America. There was a communist by the name of Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, who was very powerful in the late 60s and early 70s. And at that time, the communist element, the progressive element, as always, wanted to fundamentally change America. And they were hoping to change America by dividing America by wealth. And they wanted Americans to be bitter and angry because some people lived in a nice house or had a big bank account, and they felt they could rile people up and make them mad and bring out their worst emotions and create a revolution in America. They failed. In the late 60s and early 70s, there were a lot of bombings, there were a lot of riots, but America was still a country at heart that was proud to be American. They realized anybody in America could realize the American dream if they were willing to work hard, and the progressives failed in the late 60s and early 70s to divide America by bitterness, by economic divide. So as a fallback position, they felt, well, maybe we can divide America by race. Maybe we can create bitterness and anger if we persuade people America is a horrible racist country. And that's what they talk about in America's Cultural Revolution, the desire of destroying America because we want most Americans bitter and angry and thinking that we have a racist country. We have to get rid of the people who are pushing this division. Whether they are in American business, in academia, in government, a lot of times they're referred to as DEI specialists. And the purposes of these people is to divide America and tell people America's a horrible racist country. It's on the face, by the way, absurd if somebody else was in the room. I mean, the wealthiest subgroup in America today are Indian Americans. They do not look European in nature. Many of them come here not knowing how to speak English. Most of them who come here are not Christian. If the people were right that America was a horrible racist country that discriminated against people, these people would not be able to rise to the level they have. If you look at the other wealthiest Americans, almost none of them are of white European descent. Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans, Cuban Americans, second-generation African Americans, all outperform Native Americans. Nevertheless, this evil group of DEI people who administer these programs use their positions to try to create resentment in America. It should be a goal to cause Herbert Marcuse's predecessors, successors, cause them to fail. We ought to do all we can to get rid of these DEI specialists who encourage hate, encourage racism, encourage resentment, spread a myth that we have a big white supremacist problem in this country. There is no way when we get done with the next level of appropriation bills, this government, which is broke out of its mind, ought to still have any bureaucrats who make this pitch throughout America. So in any event, and of course during the campaign, you will notice, and some Republicans fall guilty of this as well, there are campaign promises aimed at individual ethnic groups rather than treating all Americans as one. This is not something we had to do 20 or 30 years ago. It is obvious that Herbert Marcuse, communist, or radical socialist, has achieved his goal in that at least one political party plans to maintain power by putting programs out there that benefit one ethnic group over another ethnic group, or promises financial benefits if you belong to one group over another group. And fortunately, so far, they haven't had a huge amount of success, but if you talk around, they have made some progress in persuading some people that we have a huge problem in society. In any event, certain immediate goal for this institution is to get rid of anybody preaching that DEI nonsense, certainly anybody whose position in our government is to encourage their horrible philosophy. So in any event, there are some comments on what is going on in America. Just to summarize again, I think we have to provide a little bit more oomph behind our First Amendment so that people like Hillary Clinton or John Kerry or Joseph Biden are kind of pushed to the dustbin of history if they decide to attack it or feel that's part of our problem. I think we have to be very careful to not discourage the formation of two-parent families like we have in the last 60 years. I think we have to get rid of a bureaucracy which is growing up, which tries to divide America by ethnic background. Something else that I think has to be done. And we have to educate our young people that we do not have a democracy, that James Madison and our forefathers would be shocked and stunned and disappointed if this land, which they had founded, had twisted itself all around, abandoned our respect for our Constitution and the Republic, and instead was teaching our young ones that we had a democracy, including some of the people with the greatest positions up here. So I'd like to thank the chair for giving me this time, and I'd like to yield.